So, every generation thinks the generation after them is soft, and every generation thinks the one before them had it easier. And that argument has been going on forever, and it's mostly just noise. But I want to actually look at what Gen Z walked into. Like, genuinely look at it. Because I think when you lay it all out, the honest reaction isn't, wow, they're lazy. It's actually more like, yeah, okay, that's a pretty brutal set of circumstances to start your life in. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to say Gen Z has it harder than everyone who ever lived, because that's obviously not true, and that's not the point. The point is that the specific combination of things hitting this generation right now is genuinely unique, and I don't think people are being honest enough about what that actually looks like. So think about what the timeline looks like for someone who's like 22 or 23 right now. They grew up watching the 2008 financial crisis happen to their parents. Like, they were kids watching adults panic about money and houses and jobs. And that stuff gets into you even when you're young. You absorb the anxiety even if you don't understand the details. Then they hit their teenage years and social media is already fully formed and inescapable. And I'll come back to that, but just hold that thought. Then they're getting ready to enter the workforce or go to university, and a global pandemic shuts everything down for 2 years. The exact years that were supposed to be about becoming a person, building friendships, figuring yourself out. That whole process just gets put on hold or moved onto a screen. And then, when things open back up again, they walk into one of the highest inflation environments in decades, a housing market that's genuinely closed to most people their age, and a job market that's now starting to get reshaped by AI before they've even had time to build a career. That's the runway they got. And I think if you put any previous generation on that same runway, the complaints would be identical. Okay, so the housing thing, I just want to spend the minute on because I think older generations really underestimate how different this is. There's this thing that happens where a 50-year-old will say, when I was your age, I just saved up and bought a house. And what they don't account for is that the ratio of house prices to average income has completely changed. Like, it's not even close to the same conversation anymore. The math that worked for previous generations just doesn't work now in a lot of places. And that's not a personal failing of the people it's not working for, it's just arithmetic. And it matters beyond just the house, because homeownership was one of the main ways previous generations built wealth over time. You buy early, the value goes up, you have something. And if that door is closed or significantly harder to open, then the wealth gap between generations isn't just staying the same, it's actively growing. And these aren't kids who aren't trying. A lot of Gen Z are working multiple jobs, living with parents way into their 20s because the numbers don't add up any other way, and then they get called lazy for it, which is honestly a bit rich. Now, here's where I want to be a bit careful because this part gets messy. The mental health numbers for Gen Z are genuinely alarming. Anxiety, depression, burnout hitting people in their early 20s at rates that are higher than previous generations at the same age. And we already talked about burnout peaking at 25 for this group, which is wild when you think about it. But I want to offer both sides of this because I think the honest picture has two parts. One part is that yes, the circumstances are genuinely harder in the ways I already described, and that produces real psychological strain that isn't manufactured or exaggerated. But the other part is that social media has done something specific to this generation that didn't exist before, and I don't think we fully understand it yet. Like the constant comparison, the performance of your own life, the way that validation got tied to engagement. Growing up with your social world being partially visible to everyone at all times, that's a completely new psychological environment and it creates pressures that didn't exist for anyone who grew up without it. So the mental health thing isn't just Gen Z is weaker, and it also isn't just the world broke them. It's both things happening at the same time in a combination that hasn't existed before. And that's genuinely hard to navigate, especially when you're young and you don't have the context to know it's happening to you. Quick one. If you're Gen Z, drop a comment with the one thing you wish older generations actually understood about your situation. Because I feel like that conversation is mostly happening past each other and not actually connecting. I want to read what people actually say.
Okay, so now I want to flip this a bit because I said at the start that multi-perspective is how we do things here. So let's actually steelman the criticism of Gen Z because some of it is fair. The every generation had it hard point isn't wrong. Like people who lived through actual wars, actual famines, actual systems that were explicitly designed to exclude them based on who they were, that's a different category of hard, and conflating everything into one scale doesn't serve anyone. There's also something real in the observation that Gen Z grew up with more access to information, more tools, more global connection than any previous generation. And those are genuine advantages, even if they come with downsides attached. And there is a version of the victim narrative around Gen Z that becomes its own trap, where the circumstances become a reason to stop rather than a harder starting point to work from. And those aren't the same thing, even if the circumstances are real. The people I find most interesting in this generation aren't the ones who are loudest about how hard it is. They're the ones who looked at the broken system, understood it clearly, and started building something that doesn't rely on the old rules working the way they used to. That response exists too, and it's worth naming.
So here's what I keep coming back to when I think about this. Every generation inherits the world from the one before it. And the deal has always been, things might be hard, but they'll probably be better for your kids than they were for you. That's roughly how progress works. And for a long time, that deal held up. Not perfectly, not for everyone, but as a general direction, things moved forward. What feels different right now is that for a lot of people in Gen Z, that trajectory isn't obvious anymore. Not because of anything they did, but because the economic structures that made that trajectory possible are creaking in ways that haven't fully broken yet, but clearly aren't working the same way. The job market is restructuring under AI faster than anyone has a clear answer for. The housing situation in a lot of cities isn't improving on any timeline that makes sense for people who are 23 now. The mental health infrastructure is nowhere near where it needs to be for what's actually happening to people. And when you're 22 and you look forward and the path that was supposed to be there just isn't as clear as it was for people 10 or 20 years older than you, that produces a very specific kind of anxiety that I don't think gets taken seriously enough by people who walked a clearer path.
Look, I'm not saying Gen Z has it harder than every human who ever lived, and I'm not saying the criticisms are all wrong. I think both things can be true at the same time. The circumstances are genuinely rough, and the response to them still matters. But I do think the conversation that usually happens around this generation is lazy. It's either they're soft and entitled, or they're completely victims of everything. And neither of those is actually looking at what's real. What's real is a generation that got handed a specific set of circumstances at a specific moment in history and is now trying to figure out how to build a life inside of them. And that's worth taking seriously, instead of just arguing about whose generation had it worse. If you're Gen Z and this resonated, drop a comment. And if you're not Gen Z and you think I'm being too soft on them, I also want to hear that, because that conversation is worth having properly.